Focus on Headline. All right, let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in the studio today, we have our reporters in Chung In and Arirang. Guys, welcome back.
Good evening.
Good evening to you guys. We're going to start things off with the major armed conflict between Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas. We are entering now the third and fourth day now, I should say. We have, as of now, the official death toll that we have is over 1,600 people dead on both sides. This, of course, we're talking about the Israeli side and the Palestinian side as well. It seems like tensions are escalating further. There's more attacks from both sides. Of course, Israel responding to the Hamas attack that began on Saturday. Yane, I know there's been some updates left tonight, also some unofficial figures coming in as well. Let's get the latest figures here.
Sure. So the combined death toll for both Israel and Gaza is at least 1,600, with more than 6,300 people injured. Now, that's according to the latest update that we have as of 4 p.m. today, Korea time. So today, the Israeli government press office and the health ministry released that the death toll from Hamas attacks has reached more than 900, with more than 2,600 injured. Now, that's according to AFP media outlet, as the Israeli government has gained more visibility on the situation in the southern Israel area where Hamas militants infiltrated early on the 7th. It has also confirmed that approximately 1,500 bodies of Hamas militants were also found within this area. Now, that number, for your information, is being counted separately from the general death toll. So the press office added the death toll is expected to rise further, of course, as about 150 hostages are still being held in Gaza and their safety status is unclear at the moment. Now, the dead and hostages include some foreigners from all around the world. That include the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Thailand, Nepal, Argentina, and Ukraine. The U.S. President Joe Biden released a statement on Monday local time that at least 11 U.S. citizens were among those killed in the Hamas onslaught in Israel during the weekend. And other reports from overseas media like BBC revealed that there are at least 10 British citizens that were missing and 11 from France as well. And of course, I believe the numbers are on the rise real time. So the death toll has been high in Gaza as well. Now, that has been under intensive airstrikes since Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu officially declared war on Hamas. So the Palestinian Health Ministry announced the same day that the number of deaths and the injured from the Israeli offensive on Gaza has reached around 704 and 3,726 respectively. Now, I believe that makes the combined death toll for both Israelis and Gazans at least 1,600 as of today and at this moment. But of course, the number is expected to continue to increase even as we speak at the moment.
That's right. I mean, there are some very concerning numbers. And again, while unfortunately the death toll is going to continue to rise over the next however long this armed conflict is going to take place, Yane did mention the some 150 hostages that have been taken in by the Hamas militant group. And what they're threatening is that every single time that the Israelis strike a civilian home or so in Palestine, that they're going to be executing one hostage, is what they're saying. And for our listeners out there, this the attack by the Hamas to Israel began what really was supposed to be a very celebratory day on Saturday, because it was the final day of the week-long Sukkot, which is a Jewish holiday that celebrates fall harvest, which is, I remember talking to the Israeli ambassador to South Korea, Kiva Tor, who mentioned that Sukkot is kind of like the Chuseok of Israel, as they commemorate the 40 years that the Jews spent in the desert after escaping slavery over in Egypt. So what was supposed to be celebratory, there was music festivals that was going on where I'm sure people have seen videos, footages of really innocent kids young people being shot point blank by the militant group there. And with this, Israel has vowed to use enormous force against the Hamas in retaliation for the bloodiest attack in the country in decades. For its part, Hamas issued again a chilling threat that it will execute a hostage every time Israel targets civilians in the Gaza without any warning. Arirang, let's also get some updates on that.
Sure. On Monday, a spokesperson for Hamas said his militants will kill one Israeli hostage every time Israel targets Palestinians in the Gaza Strip without warning. In an audio statement, Abu Obeida, a spokesman for the military wing of Hamas, said there will be an execution of an Israeli hostage for every bombing on Gaza by Israel. He also said such execution would be broadcast in audio and video. Obeida's message was a warning against Israel, with Israel declaring a complete siege of Gaza and pounding the area with airstrikes after Hamas launched its surprise attack on Saturday, shocking Israelis and many around the world. As Yang mentioned, more than 1,600 people died so far since Hamas militants broke through the border fence separating Israel and the Gaza Strip on Saturday, and around 150 Israelis, including foreigners, were reported to have been kidnapped. The capture of these Israeli soldiers and civilians by Hamas was stirred Israeli people's emotions more viscerally than any crisis in the country's recent memory. And this seems to present an impossible dilemma for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is considering sending ground troops into Gaza. While Hamas is using the hostages as human shields, many see the Israel's deployment of ground troops may carry the risk of many more casualties going forward and threaten the safety of those already in captivity. Instead of large-scale military actions, the option of exchanging Israeli hostages and the hundreds or thousands of Palestinians held by Israel is an option that Israel cannot take easily because it would be seen as giving up to Hamas and its propaganda. Previously, in 2016, Hamas seized a young Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit and held him in captive for more than 5 years. This has consumed Israeli society for years and prompted the country to attack the Gaza Strip. Israel ultimately released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Shalit's freedom. This time, 150 and more Israeli people are in captivity, and now eyes are on whether Netanyahu and his far-right government will continue its hawkish stance or consider releasing thousands of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom had been convicted of launching deadly attacks on Israelis.
It really does put Israel in a very tough situation because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he has... So far, we're very cautious with how we're calling this conflict right now. We're refraining from using the terminology war. We are using the terminology armed conflict for now. But it is Benjamin Netanyahu who came out and saying that it is war and that this is just their latest airstrike against the Hamas is just the beginning of what to come. And this example of what happened with the young Israeli soldier 5 years ago, back in, was it 7 years ago, check that, is a perfect example of kind of an ethical issue at hand right now, because do you risk more hostages, right? If the Hamas start realizing that they'll get more out of the 150 that are in hostage right now, in captivity right now, there's no saying that they might go ahead and kidnap furthermore to get more leverage on the matter. And just like Arirang mentioned that Netanyahu, he does hold a very hawkish stance on these matters here. So it does put them in a very, very difficult situation with the hostages. Again, I don't encourage any of our listeners to see all these footages that have been surfacing on the internet right now. But for the time being, Israel did declare a complete blockade of the Gaza area. This, of course, raising fears of humanitarian catastrophe for the estimated 2.4 million people who are residing there. Gaza has, of course, been in severe economic hardships due to the existing Israeli policies in the isolated area. If ground troops actually do enter the area, and from what I understand, Israel has already begun deploying its ground troops the high population density could lead to a larger number of casualties as we have been fearing. Yane, let's get more on this.
Sure. So Yoav Gallant, that's the defense minister of Israel, he shared on Monday local time that he has ordered a total blockade of the Gaza Strip, adding, quote, there will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, and everything will be closed. Now, it's a part of the complete siege of the area by raising the existing blockade to a much higher level of intensity than before. Now, that has already contributed to severe poverty and poor health in Gaza area. So if you look at Gaza, it has been ruled by Hamas ever since 2007 after their winning an election, and it has been under the Israeli blockade policy with 2 of its border crossing points controlled by Israel. So Gaza suffers from high unemployment and poverty, with most industrial activities halted except for small-scale agriculture and tourism. Now, further daily supplies restriction will, of course, only worsen the situations as Gaza has already been dubbed as a prison without bars, or the world's largest prison by the international human rights community. An even greater fear, of course, is coming from the prospect of a potential ground conflict against Hamas within the area. Now, many people are concerned that if the Israeli ground force commences an actual operation in Gaza, which is, of course, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with more than 5,000 people per square kilometer, the impact on civilians will be immense. Now, for your reference, Gaza covers an area slightly larger than Sejong City of South Korea, but apparently it holds a population of about 2 million people, which is more than 6 times the population of Sejong City. Now, Israel, after officially declaring war on Hamas, continues to examine the possibility of sending ground troops into their stronghold in Gaza. And I believe, as SJ mentioned, it has already commenced its move. And it is believed that the intensity and timing of this is continuously being assessed carefully because, of course, there are some concerns for the safety of hostages, including its own civilians who are currently held within the area.
Now, we've talked about some of the non-Israelis, non-Palestinians that are involved in the casualties there. So far, what we do know, according to South Korea's foreign ministry, is that there is no casualties amongst any of these South Korean nationals. But the Koreans who are staying in Israel, I believe on a short-term basis, whether it be for a business trip or even for just casual traveling, they will be on a flight. They will be returning home real soon. Let's get the details of this, Aran.
That's right, SJ. Some South Koreans in Israel are expected to return home on Tuesday local time on a Korean Air flight amid safety concerns over the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas. According to Korean Air on Monday, its KE 958 flight will depart from Tel Aviv at 1:45 p.m. Tuesday local time and arrive at Incheon International Airport at 6:10 a.m. on Wednesday. The flight will reportedly fly to Israel empty and return to Incheon, carrying South Korean passengers, becoming the first South Korean flight to land in Israel since the armed conflict broke out on Saturday. The South Korean government estimates that there are about 570 long-term South Korean residents, 480 short-term residents, and some 360 travelers in Israel. Other than 191 Koreans soon to leave the country by air today, local time, 27 Korean nationals are expected to head to neighboring country Jordan by land.
Just a quick correction. The South Koreans that are going to be arriving, they're actually going to be arriving in about an hour time. So that's going to be Tuesday at 7:10 a.m. is what we're looking at. Just did some calculation on the Israel time there. And so there's a difference of about 6 hours it is. So it should be at shortly around just after 7 p.m. is when the South Korean nationals are set to be arriving at the airport. In the meantime, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol also calling for measures to protect South Korean citizens amid the war in the armed conflict over in Israel. Tell us what he told the cabinet meeting during earlier this morning.
Sure. President Yoon Suk-yeol ordered government ministries to thoroughly prepare safety measures for Korean residents and travelers in Israel amid concerns over the escalating conflict between the country and the Hamas militant group. In a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, Yoon said the Israel-Hamas situation was heading toward a full-scale war and asked relevant ministries, with the foreign ministry taking the lead, to prepare safety measures for Korean residents and travelers. Previously on Sunday, the foreign ministry issued a travel advisory on Israel, advising all Korean nationals, including tourists, to leave through a third country as soon as possible. Yoon noted that the Israel-Hamas armed conflict has already left over 1,500 deaths. 1,600 deaths, and there have been indiscriminate shootings and kidnappings of civilians. He said as Iran and Hezbollah support Hamas, and the United States, Britain, France, and Germany support Israel's right to self-defense, the possibility that this situation might escalate into an international conflict could not be ruled out. Yoon also noted that the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East could increase economic instability, emphasizing the South Korean economy's high external dependence. He pointed out that armed conflicts and wars in the Middle East and Ukraine had led to a rise in international oil prices, and increased cost inflation had added to the price burden on Korean people. He added that as Ukraine war and the Middle East crisis overlap, external economic instability might increase. So he instructed the government to remain alert, respond closely to external factors of instability, and do its best to prevent further difficulties in people's livelihood.
I know you made the correction on the death toll there, but at the time that President Yoon Suk-yeol did make the remark, it was technically over 1,500. But we do appreciate the updates on that. Now, there's been some speculation that Iranian government were behind the masterminding of the surprise attack by the Palestinian militant group Hamas that again has led to this deadly armed conflict between the two sides here. But the Iranian government did come out issuing a statement saying that we were not involved here. Yain, let's get more on this.
Right. So it was on the 8th local time when Iran's permanent mission to the United Nations released a statement and said, quote, "We stand in unflinching support of Palestine. However, we are not involved in Palestine's response as it is taken solely by Palestine itself." Now, until now, Iran has made no secret of the fact that it has provided funding and weapons to Hamas and the Palestinian militant group Islamic Jihad, but it has not been directly involved in this incident, according to the statement. More specifically, Iran dismissed allegations that it orchestrated the Hamas attack, pointing out that the Hamas operation was a surprise and that it was the biggest failure, according to their statement, of Israel's security organizations. Iran's UN mission claimed Israel is attempting to justify their failure and attribute it to Iran's intelligence power and operational planning, adding the country is finding it very difficult to accept that in the intelligence community, it's being narrated that they were defeated by a Palestinian group. Now, the Iranian permanent mission also reiterated its view that the Hamas attack was justified. So it said in the statement, quote, "The resolute measures taken by Palestine constitute a wholly legitimate defense against 7 decades of oppressive occupation and crimes committed by the illegitimate Zionist regime." Now, if you look at why we are seeing such response from Iran is because the attack has seemingly came as Israel and Saudi Arabia have been trying to normalize their relations under the U.S. mediation in the first place. So Iran has long been pretty sensitive to Israel's improving their relations with the Sunni Islamic community, and it has deemed it as a threat to its own security and geopolitical position. And this led to the suspect that Iran may have assisted Hamas in the recent attacks.
So some are now pointing out that we talked about the $6 billion in the Iranian funds that were recently released from South Korean banks during the recent prisoner swap between the United States and Iran. There's concerns now that this fund might be used to support Hamas's recent attack in Israel, considering the long-time relationship between Iran and the Palestinian militant group. I believe when we're talking about the money, that the fund that was released, there was concern that the $6 billion Iran initially promised that would be used for a humanitarian issue probably is not going to be used for a humanitarian issue, but for other causes. Initial fear was that it might be used to further improve their nuclear capabilities, but now there's fears that it might be used in this conflict here. The Biden administration, though, obviously this would be a huge issue for the administration as they've conducted this prisoner swap. They're refuting this speculation here. So, Adan, let's get more on this.
Sure. As we've reported during our broadcast last month, the Biden administration in the U.S. agreed to unfreeze $6 billion of Iranian funds in exchange for the freedom of 5 American citizens detained in Iran. In doing so, the United States also granted clemency to 5 Iranians and allowed the transfer of these Iranian funds and then held in a South Korean bank to a bank in Qatar. While there were some criticisms against this deal inside the United States that the payment is just a ransom that would only encourage Iran's future hostage-taking. And now, with Hamas's October 7th attack, critics are going on to say that the funds might have spent for supporting Hamas militants, considering close relationship between Hamas and Iran. Even though there's no confirmation that there's a direct link between Iran and Hamas's attack on Israel, BBC reported that a Hamas spokesperson claimed that Iran gave direct backing to their militants. Now, Republicans in the U.S. are saying that the Biden administration must be held accountable for its appeasement of these Hamas terrorists, including handing over billions of dollars to them and their Iranian backers. However, pushing back against these suggestions, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Sunday the $6 billion in Iranian funds unfrozen in the recent prisoner swap had remained unspent. In an interview with CNN, Blinken said the Iranian funds previously held in South Korean bank were Iranian resources that the country had accumulated from the sale of its oil. He added Iran has the right to use these monies only for humanitarian purposes. The Biden administration also rebutted the critics' claim with 2 main reasons. First, the money hasn't yet been disbursed to Iran, but is now deposited in a restricted Qatari bank, and Iran has not accessed the money yet. Also, Iran would be able to access this money only to pay for humanitarian items such as medicine and food. Still, Biden's critics argue that Hamas could indirectly benefit from the money that Iran will eventually be able to secure from the hostage deal. U.S. Republicans, including former President Donald Trump, are claiming that Iran is behind this recent attack. During a campaign event in Waterloo, Iowa on Saturday, former President Trump said the armed conflict in the Middle East has occurred for 2 reasons, and one of them is that the United States is giving $6 billion to Iran for hostages. Former Vice President Mike Pence also blamed the president, saying that the current administration shows weakness on the world stage, kowtow to the mullahs of Iran.
This, for our listeners out there, what seems to be a armed conflict, again, so far we're calling it an armed conflict. I don't think it's a full-on war just yet, despite the fact that Israel has declared war on the Hamas, and it's not Israel-Palestine war just yet. The state of Palestine isn't the one officially at war, but it's the Palestinian militant group Hamas. But there are larger global repercussions to this, much bigger than the war in Ukraine. Although there's been Western allies of Ukraine assisting Ukraine with artillery and weaponry, and so far North Korea kind of assisting Russia, it's not going to go bigger than just that. But it's very different with Israel and the Hamas right now. There is already clear-cut teams forming at this time. The United States, the UK, France, Germany, Norway, a lot of these NATO member countries have announced their support for Israel, whereas even for the Hamas, there's been some clear-cut support as well. Namely, Iran has come out saying that. Qatar has been a long-time supporter of the Hamas. South Africa, by the way, their ruling African National Congress issued a statement saying it can no longer be disputed that apartheid, South Africa's history, is occupied Palestine's reality. We do know that Saudi Arabia, we have the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud coming out that they're in full support of the Hamas right now. Already there is a massive team forming, and there is fears that if anything does go wrong, it could turn into a third world war. And I'm not saying this very lightly right now. It is very, very concerning right now. Also, we have the global economy to be concerned about, because it's already been struggling for the past 20 months following what already was a really terrible 3 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia's invasion of Ukraine really has impacted the global economy. We're facing a new risk right now with this armed conflict between Israel and the Hamas. Experts are saying that the war poses risk to both inflation and growth prospects, and it'll take time for the full impact on the global economy to become clearer here. Yane, let's get more on this.
Sure. So the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas has raised fears that the global economic instability, which had been sparked by Russia's Ukraine invasion in February last year, will only escalate going forward, while dampening hopes and economic confidence that this inflation, which we've been seeing since the wake of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, of course, could be contained soon. Now, this will be especially troubling for the U.S. Federal Reserve, as it has been making efforts continuously to keep inflation in check while aiming for a soft landing at the same time. So the Fed and other central banks around the world are now closely watching whether this conflict could spike international oil prices, creating new inflationary pressures there. While neither Israel nor Palestine is an oil producer directly, the region itself is home to major oil producers like Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as a major shipping lane, the Gulf of Suez. So the big dilemma here is that the conflict could slow economic growth as well. Now, higher oil prices would increase the need to raise the rates further, but a slowdown would mean the rates should be lowered. So at the end of the day, the Fed is left with this task of sorting out which is a bigger headache for them, whether it is higher inflation or slower growth. However, it will take more time to get the clear picture of the impact it will have on the global economy, as it will largely depend on how long this conflict will last and whether it escalates any further. Now, an insider of the Bank for International Settlements said that the impact on oil and stock markets was immediate because it has already pushed up oil prices by 4%, and it has made riskless assets like the dollar and gold pretty much stronger than before. But it is too early to tell the full impact of the conflict just at the moment. Now, among industries that are likely to be greatly impacted by this conflict, including natural gas production, is Israel's high-tech industry, which accounts for 14% of the country's jobs and 20% of its GDP. Now, if this conflict escalates further, there could be short-term staffing challenges as tech workers are called up to the reserve forces. Just as a small part of this impact that's already happening out there, NVIDIA, the world's largest supplier of AI semiconductors, said its CEO Jensen Huang has canceled his trip to an AI summit in Tel Aviv, Israel, which was originally scheduled next week.
Again, we talked about some of the countries that are in full support of the Hamas right now, and namely Saudi Arabia being a major producer of oil. There is a very good chance that some of these Middle Eastern oil-producing countries are going to use their oil production capabilities as a leverage. And the big consensus right now is already the high oil prices. I mean, they've already been cutting production in the first place, but they could further cut production and in some ways, quote unquote, weaponize the fact that they are a oil producing country. And so again, there are major repercussions here in South Korea, even though we might not be directly involved with the conflict. As we learned over the past few years now, everything is very much connected, and big concerns that this is going to ultimately impact us as well. Let's move on to other issues. As South Korea and the U.S. continue to strengthen their bilateral alliance, Washington has decided to indefinitely suspend import restrictions for South Korean firms producing chips over in China. We talked about the concerns that some of these restrictions are going to have on the factories, South Korean factories that are in China. And this actually comes after months of Seoul's officials and businesses making their case to the U.S. Arirang, let's get the latest on this.
Sure. The presidential office said on Monday Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix will be allowed to indefinitely supply U.S. chip equipment to their China factories without separate U.S. approvals. Senior Presidential Secretary for Economic Affairs Choi Sang-mok said the U.S. government designated Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix's semiconductor plants in China as validated end users to allow the two companies to keep supplying certain U.S. chip-making tools to their China factories. Secretary Choi said in the briefing, quote, "Uncertainties about South Korean semiconductor firms' operations and investment in China have been greatly eased. They will now be able to calmly seek long-term global management strategies." The recent designation will allow the two Korean firms to import sensitive tech items for use in their Chinese chip factories without the need to obtain a permit each time. Last October, the U.S. imposed new rules to restrict advanced computing and chip production gear from entering China to curb the growth of Beijing's chip industry and its technology stealing. Samsung and SK Hynix had a one-year exemption, but Seoul has for months been pushing for an extension of that grace period, which was set to expire this month. Samsung and SK Hynix, the world's largest and second largest memory chip makers, had invested billions of dollars in their chip production facilities in China and welcomed the move. Samsung Electronics makes about 40% of its NAND flash chips at its plant in Xi'an, China, while SK Hynix makes about 40% of its DRAM chips in Wuxi and 20% of its NAND flash chips in Dalian. Data from market intelligence platform TrendForce showed that the two companies together controlled nearly 70% of the global DRAM market and 50% of the NAND flash market as of end of June.
Let's move on here, talk about domestic politics. We've been talking about the confirmation hearings for the three ministers. Well, some of them have been approved here. We have this new South Korean Defense Minister Shin Won-sik. I said this morning that the September 19th military agreement limits South Korea's ability to monitor North Korea for signs of provocation, vowing to finally suspend its effectiveness as soon as possible. Yin, let's get the latest on that.
Sure. So the remarks came during Shin Won-sik's first ever briefing at the Defense Ministry press office as he referred to attacks on Israel by the Palestinian militant Hamas. So Shin claimed if Israel had flown its surveillance and reconnaissance assets to keep an eye on the militant group, the attack might not have happened, and thus he believes South Korea should also have a very clear visibility on North Korean military movements. He said, quote, "The no-fly zone established under the September 19th military agreement severely limits real-time monitoring for signs of North Korean provocations, concluding by making a promise to push for the suspension of the agreement as soon as possible." Now, in the meantime, the South Korean Navy said that South Korea, the U.S., and Japan have conducted a maritime interdiction drill and an anti-piracy drill in the international waters southeast of Jeju Island for 2 days starting yesterday. And as a part of these drills, the U.S. nuclear-powered supercarrier U.S. Ronald Reagan, you will be entering the Busan port sometime this week between the 12th and the 16th.
Let's move on here. The National Assembly's audit of the government that kicked off Tuesday is poised to set the stage for a fierce political showdown as both the ruling and opposition parties are preparing for a rigorous 24-day evaluation. This, of course, leading up to next year's general election. Arirang, you're going to round this out. Let's get the latest of that.
Sure. The National Assembly on Tuesday began the last parliamentary audit before its term ends next year, and rival parties are expected to try to take advantage of the 24-day audit for political gains ahead of next year's general elections, which is less than 6 months away. The 17 parliamentary standing committees will audit a total of 791 government institutions, and the rival parties are bracing for an intense battle that could have significant implications for the upcoming general elections, in which voters will elect new lawmakers. One central point of contention throughout the annual parliamentary audit is expected to be multiple corruption charges faced by Representative Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the main opposition Democratic Party. The ruling People Power Party is poised to launch a full-scale offensive against the opposition leader, who has been indicted by the prosecution without physical detention. The ruling party is also expected to place the issue high on the agenda during the audit by the Legislation and Judiciary Committee, in addition to the DP's responsibility for causing a leadership vacuum in the judiciary as a result of the opposition-controlled Assembly's rejection of Supreme Court Chief Justice nominee Lee Gyun-yong on Friday. Without a Chief Justice, the top court cannot hold sessions to review sensitive and important cases. The ruling party also plans to focus on getting to the bottom of various corruption allegations related to the previous government, including the Moon Jae-in administration's alleged tampering with real estate statistics, among others. In response, the main opposition DP is expected to take the issue of what it calls a politically motivated investigation by Yoon Suk-yeol administration against its leader. Also, the DP is expected to take aim at the state affairs of President Yoon Suk-yeol, focusing on the government's handling of Japan's Fukushima wastewater release and controversial Seoul to Yangpyeong highway development plan, allegedly to help boost the value of properties owned by the First Lady and her family.
Of course, the first day of the National Assembly audit began with some questioning on the Interior Minister Lee Sang-min over the Itaewon Crowd Crush incident, where, of course, the main opposition Democratic Party came out slamming them for not. One of the lawmakers basically said is, if you are leading a ministry that's in charge of the safety and such disaster happened, it is only right that you resign so that there is no recurrence of the issue. But of course, the PPP rebutted that, saying that it causes a vacuum in that position, and arguing that in the, I believe, like over 5 months, I believe, that Mr. Lee was out of position, that there was a number of incidents, disasters that happened, namely the flooding that took place earlier in the year. But this is going to get quite fierce, so we'll get your more updates on the matter, not to mention the latest on the armed conflict between Israel and the Hamas. For now, guys, thank you very much for your reports. Have a safe one, and we'll see you guys again.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.